The first thing they felt was the cold water swallowing their legs, long before the gunfire found them. Dawn hadn't fully broken over Omaha Beach, yet the air was already thick with smoke, the kind that clung to skin and turned every breath into a reminder that death was close. Waves pushed bodies back and forth like broken reminders of a plan that had failed before it truly began. And somewhere in that rising haze, a 51-year-old brigadier general stepped off a landing craft and walked straight into the killing zone. He
This
could
tread
see what his
assembly
men
needs
could not.
adjustment before the next stage.
The broken tanks, the seawall crowded with soldiers who had stopped moving. The German bunkers high above them, untouched and waiting. Nothing in the manuals prepared anyone for this moment, when doctrine died on the sand and survival demanded something far more human than strategy. What makes a man walk forward when thousands have already been cut down for taking just one step too far? Before this day ended, that question would shape the fate of the entire invasion. And the answer would come from a general who refused to crawl. They had believed firepower would clear the way. For months, planners insisted that no fortress, no bunker line, no coastal defense could withstand the weight of American naval guns and high-altitude bombers. Thousands of tons of explosives were scheduled to fall on a 5-mile stretch of French coastline. The mathematics felt reassuring. The confidence felt absolute. But war does not answer to numbers, and on the morning of June 6th, the truth revealed itself in smoke and silence. The ships had fired from too far offshore, their shells screaming past the bunkers and exploding harmlessly inland. The bombers flying through thick cloud cover had released their payloads late, cratering empty fields instead of German fortifications. Rommel's defenses, 6-foot thick concrete, interlocking arcs of machine gun fire, mines buried under sand and surf, stood exactly as they had been designed. The men who built them had expected this bombardment, and they had survived it. When the first assault waves neared the beach, the sea itself turned against them. Landing craft struck sandbars and dropped their ramps into deep water, pulling men under the moment they stepped forward. The weight of their equipment dragged them down in seconds. Others surfaced only to meet machine gun fire coming from the bluffs 200 feet above. Strong Point WN-71, overlooking Dog Green sector, waited like an executioner. Company A of the 116th Infantry moved toward it without knowing they were marching straight into a perfect field of fire. The ramp went down. The slaughter began. Some men died before they touched the water. Others tried to swim toward shore only to collapse beneath the weight of 60 pounds of gear. The few who staggered onto the sand found no protection, only a low seawall, barbed wire, and a killing ground mapped out by German gunners long before the invasion fleet appeared on the horizon. By the end of 30 minutes, Company A had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Nearly every officer was dead or wounded. Whole platoons had vanished into the surf. Across Omaha, the pattern repeated itself. DD tanks meant to support the infantry had sunk in the rough seas. Radios failed. Units landed in the wrong sectors and dissolved before their officers could find them. Engineers carrying Bangalore torpedoes were shot down before they reached the wire. Mortar rounds fell with mathematical precision onto landing craft still trying to unload. Yet amid this collapse, thousands of men clung to life behind the seawall, soaked, disoriented, but still breathing. They had been trained to push inland, to advance past the wire, to seize the bluffs. But training collapses under the weight of reality, and on this morning, reality was merciless. Every assumption the planners had made was gone. The beach had become a graveyard, and through the smoke, one man was walking toward them. The seawall was never meant to hold an army. It was only a pause, a thin line between terror and the impossible climb toward the bluffs. Yet thousands of men were pressed against it, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell them how to live through the next minute. Officers were dead, radios were silent, and the chain of command lay scattered in the surf. What moved along the beach now was not an army, but fragments of one. Norman Cota understood this better than anyone. When he stepped off to the open sand and reached the seawall, he found soldiers staring back with empty expressions, their faces carrying the frozen look of men who had seen too much in too little time. They weren't cowards. They weren't unwilling. They were simply human, and humanity falters under unbroken fire. Cota crouched beside them, speaking not with the authority of a general, but with the urgency of someone who knew the next 10 minutes would decide everything. Then he stood up and walked forward. Fire cracked overhead as he crossed the open ground, moving toward a section of wire that naval gunfire had twisted but not destroyed. A group of Rangers huddled near it, pinned down by a machine gun 70 yards up the slope. They had tried twice to rush the gap. Twice the first man through had been cut down. Cota listened to their explanation, glanced at the wire, then at the bunker above. "Well," he said, "Rangers, lead the way." He did not wait for a reply. He walked straight through the gap. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to hold his breath. The German gun did not fire, whether by chance, reload, or distraction no one ever knew. But Cota reached the far side, turned, and motioned the Rangers forward. 12 men followed before the machine gun found its voice again. Shots snapped through the grass, but the momentum had shifted. Cota crawled up the slope, directing suppressive fire while 2 Rangers worked their way to the flank. A pair of grenades ended the bunker's defiance. It was the first German strongpoint on Omaha Beach to fall. Word spread faster than any order could. Somewhere down the line, men heard the rumor. A general had broken through at Vierville. And with that, something changed inside them. Small groups rose from behind the shingle, moving not as organized companies, but as determined fragments of what remained. Sergeants grabbed whoever was nearby. Lieutenants shouted directions to men they'd never seen before. Engineers dragged Bangalore torpedoes up the sand while riflemen covered them, detonating paths through the wire in 4-meter bursts. None of it matched the plan. All of it worked. The Germans had built their defenses to stop a regiment moving in formation. They were not prepared for squads slipping through grass, crawling up defilades, or throwing grenades into rear firing slits. What had begun as chaos was transforming into infiltration. And high above the beach, in bunker after bunker, defenders who had dominated the dawn suddenly found themselves fighting enemies they could no longer see. By mid-morning, the German line was no longer a line at all. It had frayed into isolated strong points, pockets of resistance, surrounded by American infantry who refused to remain where doctrine said they should die. The defenders had trained for a structured assault, for a grand push supported by armor and wave after wave of organized units. What they faced instead were small, relentless groups, slipping through every fold of terrain, appearing where no attacker should have been. For the Germans, the first sign of collapse was silence. Machine guns that once dominated an entire sector, now reduced to rationing ammunition. Mortar crews counted their remaining shells like silver coins, saving them for moments that never came. Artillery observers, cut off from headquarters, reported that supply lines had vanished under craters and smoke. The naval bombardment had not destroyed the bunkers, but it had shattered the roads behind them. Reinforcements could not move. The Panzers, the very force Rommel believed would crush the invasion, remained trapped inland by Allied aircraft prowling the skies. Meanwhile, on the slopes rising above the beach, American infantry advanced meter by meter. 4-meter gaps in the wire became 12. A trench taken here opened the way for another assault 50 yards farther. The beach was no longer a killing ground. It was a funnel guiding men upward, and every small victory, every captured machine gun, widened that funnel a little more. But the cost was staggering. The 1st Infantry Division lost over 1,000 men in a single day. The 29th suffered hundreds more. Rangers were reduced to thin, exhausted lines. Engineers paid with their lives for every Bangalore torpedo placed under fire. In some companies, ranks thinned so quickly that sergeants were commanding platoons and privates were leading fire teams. No official tally could capture the human weight of those hours. And yet some stories endured. A medical company hit by artillery before they even reached the beach. 20 men jumping into the waves, most never resurfacing. Captain Emerald Ralston reaching shore with only 12 survivors out of 90. Medics working with bare hands, scavenging morphine from the dead, turning scraps of cloth into life-saving bandages. On Fox Green sector, Staff Sergeant Arnold Lambert worked for 14 straight hours behind a concrete block barely 3 feet high, treating more than 300 casualties under constant fire. He survived the war, lived to be 100, and spoke of D-Day the way many veterans did, with humility that felt heavier than any boast. "I just did my job," he said. That was all. But history knows better. By early afternoon, 3 of the 5 main beach exits were in American hands. German commanders begged for permission to withdraw to secondary positions, but orders from above denied them any ground. They held until they could hold no longer, and then they died where they stood. Those who surrendered did so because their rifles were empty, their belts carried no more ammunition, and the tide of men climbing the bluffs would not stop. Omaha Beach had been the edge of catastrophe. Now it was the beginning of a foothold. From a distance, the bluffs above Omaha looked like just another stretch of the Norman coast. But to Allied planners, they were a gateway. And without that gateway, the liberation of Europe risked collapsing before it had even begun. What happened on those few hundred yards of sand in the early hours of June 6th would ripple across oceans, governments, and alliances. Strategically, Omaha was the anchor. To the east, British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword had pushed inland with moderate casualties. To the west, Utah Beach had succeeded through a fortunate mislanding. But without Omaha linking them, the Allied line would fracture into isolated pockets. A 30-mile gap in the front would give German reserves a clear opportunity to strike each beachhead in turn, defeating them piecemeal. A single failure could have undone the entire invasion. And the world knew it. American commanders watching from offshore saw no movement on Omaha for nearly 3 hours. At one point, some considered pulling units back into the channel. Had that order been given, and had Cota not broken through when he did, the consequences would have reached far beyond the Norman shore. The Allies needed a deep water port, and Omaha was the only beach where one could be seized quickly. Without it, reinforcements and supplies would choke offshore while German forces regrouped on land. In Moscow, Stalin was already suspicious that the Western Allies were slow to open a second front. Another failed invasion after Dieppe, after years of delay, could have fractured the alliance at the moment it was most fragile. Some historians argue that a disaster at Omaha might have pushed the Soviet Union to test a separate peace with Germany, reshaping the map of Europe before the endgame had fully begun. But that did not happen. Instead, the world watched as American soldiers, disorganized, bloodied, leaderless, rose from the seawall and climbed the bluffs one trench at a time. They did what doctrine could not. They did what strategy had failed to plan for. Their advance ensured that the invasion held, the alliance remained intact, and the vision of a liberated Europe stayed alive. By late afternoon, Omaha was secure. The beachhead deepened. Supplies began flowing, and the strategic nightmare that had loomed over the morning quietly evaporated into history. The world would remember Normandy as a turning point. But only those who survived Omaha understood how close that turning point came to slipping away. History rarely remembers the quiet moments after victory, the stillness that follows the last burst of gunfire. Yet on the evening of June 6th, as the tide crept back across Omaha Beach, it moved over more than equipment and debris. It moved over the cost of a foothold, over the men who had broken an impossible line, over the decisions made in seconds that shaped the future of a continent. Norman Cota never asked to be the symbol of that day. His medals did not mention the moment he walked through machine gun fire, nor the hours he spent pulling soldiers to their feet when everything around them said to stay down. His tombstone at West Point carries only the basics: his name, his rank, his dates of service. Nothing about Omaha. Nothing about how thousands followed him, simply because he showed them how. But legacy is not carved in stone. It is carried in memory by the divisions that trace their lineage through Normandy, by the families who walk the rows of white graves on a windy bluff above the channel, and by every soldier who understands that leadership is not about rank, but about stepping forward when forward feels impossible. Omaha Beach reminds us that plans can fail, firepower can miss, and entire operations can hang on the courage of individuals whose names the world may never learn. It reminds us that history turns not only on generals and governments, but on sergeants, medics, engineers, and the men who believed that taking one more step might matter. And it did. As you reflect on this story, consider the question the soldiers of Omaha answered with their lives. What does it truly mean to advance when standing still feels safe? Their answers shape the world we live in. If this story moved you, we invite you to stay with us as we explore more of the moments, known and forgotten, that defined the Second World War. Subscribe to join a community dedicated to remembering them. And if you feel compelled, share your thoughts below. What do you believe is the lasting lesson of Omaha Beach? We read every comment. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.